Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz pianist and composer George Kahn. He opened up about his latest 2018 CD called Straight Ahead and talked about his childhood in New Rochelle, New York, studying classical music from the age of 9. He began composing while he was in high school, and he did some gigs in the Boston area and on the East Coast with the disco band, but he eventually moved to California in 1976. He has been a major force in the Los Angeles jazz community since the late 90s. He took some time off from music and came back stronger than ever. This is just one tale in the annals of many. So please get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
George, thanks for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz. I appreciate it, man.
You're welcome.
So let's go ahead and start off with Straight Ahead. It's a great album, and I want to know what kind of artistic vision went into this album?
There were a couple of main things I was looking at. One was the primary motivation was I'd never recorded just a jazz trio album, just piano, bass, drums. Every other project I've done over the years has been either quartet, quintet, larger 8-piece group. Sometimes there'd be one trio cut on the CD, but I never really focused on that format, and I really wanted to create a document that really presented the piano, bass, drums trio format, because that's really one of the things that got me into jazz to begin with, and so in a way, I was kind of going back to my roots. So that was number one. Number two was getting the right players. So when I had the idea, my favorite drummer here in LA is Alex Acuna, and Alex has played on a couple of my albums in the past, and he's kind of busy, and to get him to commit to a project is not always the easiest thing. But I called him up and I kind of explained what the plan was, and he was totally on board. He was saying, "Yeah, let's do it. When do you want to start?" And so that was kind of a linchpin item, once I got that in there. And then Lyman Medeiros, I've worked with for years now. He's my number one bass player call. So, getting the players lined up, that was definitely part of the vision. And then in terms of material, I wanted to, feature my originals, which I love writing and composing. I think that's probably one of my stronger elements of what I do. But then I also knew how important it is to have songs that people recognize to make the album, more approachable. And rather than just do standards in songs that everybody's heard, I decided to really focus on not original tunes, but recent tunes written by pop artists, people like Prince, Adele, Ed Sheeran. So they'd be songs that people would recognize, but they wouldn't recognize them in a jazz format, because they've either never been done that way or rarely been done that way. And so that was kind of the overriding vision of the album, was kind of those two points of, bringing new music to the jazz genre, and also, featuring my originals.
So let's get back to the beginning of your life in New Rochelle, New York. You started studying classical music at 9 and didn't start doing composing until you got in high school. Talk to me about how you got involved with jazz, maybe some of the first albums, and kind of that early life of yours.
Oh, sure. Yeah, my original focus was classical music. That, and then, growing up in the 60s, rock and roll was a big feature in everybody's life back then, I think. And the sad thing for me was that even though I grew up, Joe, in New Rochelle, New York, it was just 45 minutes outside of the city. Even through high school, I was not really into jazz, and so I was going down to the Village and seeing the Mothers of Invention or seeing Cream or whoever. But meanwhile, around the corner, John Coltrane was performing, and I'm going, "Who's that?" So I kind of missed that boat, which was unfortunate. I didn't really get into jazz until I was in college, and that was, early exposure would have been like, Take Five, Jay Brubeck, the things that became enormously popular in the popular culture. But in terms of really focusing on jazz and getting deep into the music, that didn't happen until college, and my first memory of that was when I was a freshman in college. I went to Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, and I remember going with a friend to somebody's apartment in either in Somerville or Cambridge, somewhere over that way, and he was playing this album, Kulu Se Mama by John Coltrane, and it just blew my mind. Just the sound and the whole thing, the album cover, just everything was like, oh my God, there's like a whole other world here. And that, I think, was the first real door opening for me. And then from there, I just started really plunging into improvisatory music and jazz music in general. Yeah.
So you were in Cape Cod and you performed around Boston for a little while, and then you go all the way to the other coast to California. How did that transpire, and did you go through any kind of culture shock or anything in that adjustment?
Good question. How that transpired was, after I graduated with a degree in music, and then I bummed around Cape Cod for 2.5 years, literally as a beach bum working in a record store, during the day. And I kept telling people I was a musician, but I wasn't really playing that much. And I realized that, it was time to stop saying I was a musician and, start being one. So I moved back to Boston and started gigging there. And again, this is mid-'70s. There is and there was at that time a jazz scene in Boston, but it was primarily filled with students, people that were studying at Berkeley or wherever. And so to actually make a living as a jazz musician in Boston was impossible unless you were a teacher. And I didn't have my master's or anything like that. So I just started gigging, taking road gigs with different bands, whatever. And after about a year of that, I realized, if I'm going to really make this happen, it's got to be either New York or L.A. And having grown up outside New York, I knew I didn't want to go to New York. New York's an exciting city. I love visiting it, but just a little intense for me. The idea of trying to maneuver a Fender Rhodes piano up and down to up an apartment or a gig or whatever, and through the subway, it just wasn't appealing, And at that point, a couple of my musician friends had already moved to Los Angeles, and I contacted one of them. This is back in the day when we wrote letters.
Yeah. I remember those days.
You remember those days? Okay. So I wrote a letter to my friend in L.A. He was living in Hollywood in an apartment. I said, New York, L.A., what do you think? What should I do? And he said, well, the worst thing that'll happen if you come to L.A. is you're going to end up in a band like you're in now, touring and playing rock and roll. And the best thing is it could be anything, because it's Hollywood and dreams happen here. And besides, you can sleep on my floor until you find a place to stay. And I went, oh, done. That was it. So I threw all my stuff, including the Fender Rhodes, into a Dodge A100 van, and my bass player friend and I drove across country, and the rest is history. And then that was it. No culture shock. I mean, I would have had more culture shock, I think, moving to New York. I was already very fascinated by the music scene in LA, the cross-pollination between the studio cats and the jazz albums, and that were coming out of the city. And so I just plunged into it. I loved the whole scene.
So obviously everything's worked out for you in Los Angeles.
Yes, I'd say.
Okay. There you go. So my question is this. When you got there, how long did it take for you to start getting the gigs that you wanted and getting into that music fold that you really did want to get into?
That's a long story, which I'll try to give you a brief version of this. So I moved out here wanting to really focus on jazz. Like most musicians, you realize that you may want to play jazz, but you may have to play everything. You got to take what you get. And I was, fairly versatile pianist, so I was getting, a fair amount of gigs, and then at a certain point I realized my real focus and what I really wanted to do was more composition. And so I started studying privately with a guy named Spud Murphy, who some people may know. He's a big band arranger from the 40s and 30s and 40s, who also created a whole orchestration technique and film scoring technique. So I studied with him for about 5 years, and really focused on moving into that arena for my musical experience. And that worked out okay, but it was kind of like beating your head against a wall. It's hard to break in, like anything in the music business is you either get a lot or you don't get much, And so there was a certain point there back in the mid-'80s where I really got burnt out, and I just left the music business. I totally stopped playing, stopped writing. I dropped out, and I dropped out for about 15 years. Pursued other avenues to make money, you know. And then fast forward to about 1998, and the music world had changed. 1998, you had MP3s, you had the internet, and it was suddenly possible to create your own music and have it distributed without having to work with a gatekeeper at a record company or anybody telling you what you should record or what you should do. And I just latched onto that, and at that point, I was ready to plunge back into music, and I thought, what did I always want to do? And my passion had always been that late 50s, early 60s period of jazz. Miles Davis kind of blue, early Herbie Hancock, Red Garland, Wynton Kelly, all those great jazz pianists of that period. And so I thought, well, if that's what I want to do, I'm just going to do that. So I started producing my own albums. My first one came out in 1999, and since then it's been really a focus on that, what I call classic jazz, early, late bebop, early swing, and period of music, and that's what I decided to do, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
Well, and it looks like too you've been doing some fundraisers for the homeless out there in LA. It seems like to me, based on what I see, the projects that you're doing, once you came back to music, there was a different consciousness that went into this. Do you feel refreshed? Do you feel more invigorated by being in music now than you were, say, younger when you were in Cape Cod and getting into it?
Yeah, I absolutely do. Yeah, there's an excitement for me at this point, I think, in that, the projects I do are things that really excite me, and you mentioned the fundraiser aspect. I do something that I've developed over the last few years is I have a larger group called the Jazz and Blues Review. We put out an album in 2014, and that group includes 3 female singers, and we do a variety of jazz vocal styles, again, starting from the 40s up to the 80s. And with that group, we do an annual fundraiser for an organization called PATH, which is People Assisting the Homeless. And it started kind of small initially, and the charity started kind of small, and now PATH is a multi-million-dollar charity, and we do an annual fundraiser for a division of PATH, which is a division that builds permanent housing for the formerly homeless. And over the years, it's just grown and grown. Last year, we brought in about $80,000 for the charity from our fundraiser. I'm just so thrilled to be part of that and to help make a change there.
So let me ask you this: after all these years of being in music and going on hiatus and coming back and being where you're at today, are you happy with how your career's turned out?
Yeah, I am. It's interesting. I look at my career in relation to, jazz, because that's really what I love to do and what I want to do. And I'm a realist about this stuff to a good extent. This may or may not be surprising to you or to your listeners, but when I started recording jazz albums, which was 20 years ago, I did a little research, and jazz music, as far as sales, was about 3% of all sales in the United States, music sales. And, it's clearly a niche market, right? Well, fast forward 20 years later, now jazz is about 1.5% of all music sales. The numbers are not going in the right direction, which is a sad thing. And along with that, I believe that jazz has become very regionalized. It's almost impossible to do a U.S. tour unless you are Christian McBride or Herbie Hancock or someone of that caliber. There's the upper level of people can pull that off. But that's the bad news. But the good news is that because it's been regionalized, every city has amazing jazz players and has amazing places to play jazz. And that's certainly true for L.A. Just in the last year, a couple of new clubs have opened up here in Los Angeles that are really cool listening rooms. So I'm unhappy that the market hasn't grown, but I am very happy with the interest and the level of what's going on here in LA. It's again, it's not getting bigger. It's more moving, constantly moves sideways, But there's as I say, there's always new rooms and new people that come along and go, we want to create a jazz scene, and so it keeps flowing. And the thing that I like, after doing it and being part of the LA jazz scene as long as I have, is that there's a level of, I've reached a level of, I don't know what the word is, respectability and influence that I can usually get into the rooms that I want to get into, which is pretty much all I can ask for. That and having people download the album every now and then. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of clubs, sometimes the most influential teachers in your life are the live shows that you've seen. And speaking of jazz, what shows have you seen that have left a deep impression on you?
Well, there's one in particular, since you asked that question, that always comes to mind, and that's when I saw the Bill Evans Trio in Boston. And this was, I believe, I'm trying to remember, I think it was 1975. I moved out here in 76, so it was right before I moved to LA. I was still living in the Boston area. And Bill Evans was playing with Joe LaBarbera and I can't remember the bass player's name right now. They were playing one of the clubs in Boston, because it was Jazz Workshop was what it was called. You would walk down into the basement, and there it was, And it was amazing to see him perform live. And then during the break, he was sitting at the bar, and I thought, I'm just going to go up and say hello. So I got up all my nerve and sat down next to him and said, Bill, I really appreciate your music. It means so much to me. And we just started chatting. He was like totally friendly. We had a lovely conversation. And at a certain point in the conversation, he pulled out his wallet and he pulled out a picture of his son, Evan, who at that point I think was like 1, maybe 2. And he said, I love playing music, but this, and he pointed to the picture, he said, this is really where it's at. Family is really where it's at. And don't lose sight of that. That was really an amazing thing. And then, then they finished the second set, and I think the next day he flew to Japan on his world tour, wherever he was going, that really stuck with me. So that was a very cool moment.
That's a great story.
And what's interesting is I just saw Joe LaBarbera last weekend. He was playing Disney Hall with Justo Almario and Eric Reed on piano. And so Joe teaches at Cal Arts, so he's become a fixture of the LA jazz scene, and it's always a pleasure to see him play. He's definitely one of the great old school drummers. It was almost like watching Shelly Manne or Gene Krupa, play. Just real lot of loose. He's just loose, so loose,
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool to watch. Yeah.
So let me ask you this: why do you love jazz?
I love jazz because it's always new. It's the improvisational aspect of jazz is what has always attracted me to it. That's why I love listening to jazz, and I love playing jazz because it's like having a 2 or 3 hour communication with your best friends when you play live. It's just like, we have a format. We're going to have a discussion. The discussion may be Green Dolphin Street, or the discussion may be Thieves in the Temple. Whatever the topic is, we then get to spend 4 or 5 minutes, talking about it, working it out,
Yeah,
and
I dig it.
I just love it. I just love it.
Let me ask you this. Everything is going to come down to this. Everyone has a version of you. Your family, your friends, your fans, but you run your ship. So tell me, who do you think you are?
That's a deep question, Joe. I think I'm an open, responsive, giving person. On my good days, I start the day by stretching, meditating, and then just asking myself, who can I give to today? Who can I help today in one way or another? That's, I think, who I am. And I do carry that into my work day, and I carry it into my composition, and I carry it into the gigs I play. I respect the musicians I work with. I want to make sure they're paid well. I want to make sure we're playing clubs that respect the music. Try to just carry that forward.
That's a great answer. That's what I was looking for, and I think that's a great way to wrap everything up. Thank you for taking a little time out and talking about your career, talking about your latest album, and opening up with me on jazz. I appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in California, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to George for his time, his stories, and his music. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.